Hello, Dad and family. Thanks for joining me to watch my final project presentation for this class. I'm looking forward to spending time with you during the school break. But before we begin, I want to explain a few key terms that will help make this presentation easier to follow. First, context. It describes the time, place, culture, and circumstances of the people during the period we're examining. The second term is primary sources. They're something from the time itself, like a document or object. In our case, we'll use documents written by the people who originally wrote them. And finally, the third term is secondary sources. This is a historian or a scholar who takes primary sources and explains or interprets those events for us, giving us a better perspective on what the events mean at that time and from today's perspective. These will help us to understand how and why reform happens throughout church history. Let's begin with my thesis that focuses on the tension between the gospel and institutional power, which are two key words to listen for during the presentation. The tension I'm highlighting is that the gospel calls for simplicity, service, and salvation, while institutional power can lead to control, wealth, and political influence. My thesis argues that throughout history, the church has followed a pattern. As it grows in power, it begins to drift, and then, once recognized, is called back to the simplicity of the gospel through a type of reform. I see the reforms in two ways. One, the reform of consciousness, as exemplified by the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the missionaries of America. And the second type as a structural reform, such as the Council of Trent. This pattern will help us understand why reform is not a one-time event, but as we will see, something that happens repeatedly. To understand this pattern, we will look at three key events in church history. The first one is the Constantine era, when Christianity moved from persecution to power. The second is the Council of Trent, where the church responded to an internal crisis and external challenge. And the third is the missionary expansion, in which the church encountered new cultures and new questions regarding humanity. Each of these moments illustrates how the church responds when it begins to drift from the gospel and is drawn into the influence of power, politics, and wealth. This is the theme I'm highlighting as the pattern of the church. Let's begin with the Constantine era. Here, Christianity began as a small, persecuted faith within the Roman Empire. Early Christians gathered in homes, practiced quietly, and often faced punishment or even death for their beliefs. This changed dramatically in the 4th century when Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians the freedom to worship openly. Christianity moved from a persecuted minority to a legalized and eventually powerful institution within the empire. This would be an example of a primary source that came from Constantine. As Justo L. Gonzalez, a historian, explains, secondary source, this shift brought both new opportunities and new risks for the church. With imperial support, the church gained influence, structure, and the ability to worship publicly. What was happening was that worship was moving from private homes into large basilicas, and Christian life was becoming more visible and organized. At this point, these are all great changes that are taking place. However, this also marks a turning point at which the church begins to move towards institutional power, creating a tension with the simplicity of the gospel. So what went wrong? The problem wasn't the church's growth, but rather how the growth began to shape its identity. As Christianity became integrated into Roman culture, it began to reflect the empire's political and social structures. Their authority increased, wealth became more desirable, and church leaders, especially bishops, assumed civil responsibilities where bribery was customary at that time. Faith, once requiring discipline and sacrifice, became more socially and widely accepted. As scholar Laura Swan notes, this shift reflects a movement away from personal holiness towards institutional identity. As a result, the requirement for discipleship becomes diluted, and the focus shifted away from spiritual devotion, leading the church to become institutionalized. This reflects the drift away from the gospel, in which the attraction to power and authority began to overshadow the simplicity, service, and devotion of earlier Christianity. At this point, the church is no longer being persecuted by imperial power, but it is instead becoming imperial power itself. In response to this shift, some Christians chose a very different path. Rather than embracing the church's growing influence, they sought to withdraw from society and move into the desert. These men and women, known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers, wanted to return to the roots of Christianity, to a more disciplined and focused life of faith that emphasized prayer, repentance, and self-denial. This became the new form of martyrdom, witnessing by giving up all worldly possessions in sacrifice and complete dependence on God. As historian Helen Waddell describes it, they sought a pure life of prayer and asceticism centered on God rather than on society. Their goal was not to reject the church, but to rediscover what it meant to live the gospel fully. By stepping away from wealth, power, and social expectation, they sought to restore their relationship with God. This movement represents one of the earliest forms of reform in Christian history, showing that reform often begins with individuals seeking holiness. This reflects a return to the gospel simplicity through disciplined living. Let's compare this to the Franciscan tradition. This pattern of reform does not end in the desert. It reappears later in the life of Francis of Assisi, who responds to similar challenges within the church. Like the Desert Fathers and Mothers, Francis rejects wealth, power, and social status to live the gospel more fully. He embraces poverty, humility, and service, choosing to live among the people rather than in structures of power. As Francis writes in his own words, what was once difficult becomes transformed through a life centered on God. His response reflects a return to simplicity and devotion. This shows that reform is not only about correcting church structures, but about transforming each of us individually from the heart. Together, the Desert Movement and Francis reveal a consistent pattern in Christian history. When the church becomes closely tied to power and influence and drifts away from its core beliefs, reform emerges through a return to the gospel. This reinforces the tension between institutional power and gospel simplicity and underscores the need for continual renewal. The need for reform in the church did not happen suddenly, but gradually. Over time, patterns of abuse and neglect became more visible. As scholar John W. O'Malley notes, calls for reform were already increasing, indicating the church was aware of deeper issues. But with the church's authoritative power, it chose to ignore the accusations. The alleged abuses included papal authority, questionable financial practices, and moral failures among the clergy. as positions were often influenced by wealth rather than vocation, and many clergy were absent from their communities. As a result, the faithful were being neglected spiritually. The church, which was called to serve, began to reflect institutional power rather than the gospel of simplicity. It failed to recognize the seriousness of these problems and their impact. The church was losing sight of its flock as it was distracted by worldly power and riches. This reveals a clear moment of drift where the church moves away from its gospel mission and towards control, wealth, and authority. So what went wrong in this situation? The issue wasn't only the presence of corruption, but also the failure to address it effectively and in a timely manner. Reform from within the church was often slow and limited in its ability to create real change. The internal investigation of Concilium de Emendanda Ecclesia confirms that the same abuses persisted, describing many abuses and grave diseases within the church. This shows that the problems were not only the subject of external criticism, but also were recognized from within. At the same time, Martin Luther took a direct and confrontational approach to these abuses. He placed responsibility on the Pope and challenged that the structure that protected the church from reform, arguing that the barriers had been built to prevent accountability. This created tension between internal recognition and external pressure. As reform became associated with division and conflict, the church began to view reform itself as a threat rather than an opportunity. This meant they were slow to respond to the situation in taking action. At this point, the church was not only drifting from the gospel, but also ignoring and resisting the correction it needed. As we will see, this pattern of drift continues in the life of the church, where reform is needed. The Council of Trent represents the church's formal response to this crisis. Rather than reacting quickly, the council addressed both doctrine and reform carefully over time. The council met for over 18 years, showing the seriousness and the depth of the issues it was confronting. During this time, it produced extensive decrees and canons that clarified Catholic teaching and addressed the need for reform. Although the actions taken were positive, the time it took to accomplish them had no impact on the reconciliation of the fracture of the Protestant Reformation. The Council defined key teaching, including original sin and justification. While it agreed with the Reformers on the reality of sin, it emphasized that grace is not only given as a gift, but is also transformational, working within and through the person. This is a fundamental difference between Catholics and Protestants. At the same time, Trent addressed institutional problems. It reformed clerical discipline, corrected abuses of authority, wealth, and neglect. The council also established seminaries to properly train priests in correct doctrine and expected moral behavior. As historian John W. O'Malley explains, the council had a clear purpose to affirm doctrine and reform the leadership of the church. This marks a turning point as the church begins to move back towards its gospel foundation through clarity, structure, and doctrine. Reform restores the church to gospel values. But structural reform alone is not enough, as a change of heart is also needed. While the Council of Trent focused on institutional reform, the Franciscan tradition reminds us that reform must also begin within the person. Francis of Assisi emphasizes humility, reverence, and return to the simplicity of the gospel. His approach focuses on interior transformation with grace, not just external correction. As a personal example, it becomes clear in my hospital ministry. As I encounter patients who are suffering, uncertain, and facing difficult moments in their lives, when I offer prayer or communion, which are forms of grace, I often see a visible response, sometimes even tears. In those moments, grace is not abstract, but a gift of love. It also is active and transformative, changing the person from the inside out. This reflects what the Council of Trent sought to clarify regarding the Church's faith and belief. Grace is not only given as a gift, but also works within the person to actively restore and renew their relationship with God as their free will. Together, Francis and Trent showed that true reform requires both structure and personal transformation. The Church is called not only to correct itself institutionally, but also to return to the gospel in the heart of each person. Now, let us look at our last example of the missions. The missionary expansion of the Church during the Age of Exploration introduced a new kind of challenge. Christianity was no longer confined to Europe, as advances in navigation and shipbuilding enabled voyages to the ends of the earth. This created opportunities to carry the gospel message across the world into entirely new cultures and societies. As this expansion took place, the Church became closely connected with imperial and colonial power. Exploration brought new sources of wealth and political influence, but it also created serious consequences for the people being encountered. Unfortunately, with this expansion, indigenous people in the Americas faced conquest, exploitation, and slavery. This raised new theological and ethical questions about culture, salvation, and human dignity. As historian Francisco Morales explains, there were tenacious disputes between religious, governors, and colonizers, all trying to impose their own plan on indigenous society. This moment reveals a new kind of tension. The mission of spreading the gospel becomes closely tied to political power, creating conditions in which the purpose of evangelization is no longer clear. The recurring theme of power and wealth blinds the Church to the full consequences. What went wrong was not the mission of evangelizing, but how it was shaped by power and authority. The Church's mission of salvation became entangled with the empire's political and economic goals. Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bulls Dum Diversa and Romanus Pontifex, authorizing European rulers to expand their territories and exercise control over non-Christian people. These documents authorized land seizure and the enslavement of inhabitants, which directly contradicts the Church's mission of salvation and human dignity. As stated in these decrees, rulers were given authority to invade, search out, and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. The consequences of the Church's declaration are described by Franciscan friar Toribio del Montelina as including plagues, famine, and widespread death that devastated indigenous people, in some cases wiping out nearly half the population. These events were often described as acts of God, even though they were closely tied to the realities of conquest, exploitation, and European-born disease. Unfortunately, these acts were justified in the name of Christ. This shows a clear distortion of the gospel. The mission of the Church, which is meant to bring salvation and dignity, becomes aligned with domination, wealth, and control. This demonstrates a clear tension with the gospel. In response to these conditions, voices within the Church began to challenge the direction of missionary efforts. Bartolomé de la Casa, a bishop of the Church, witnessed the abuse of indigenous people firsthand and became a strong advocate for their dignity and rights. He argued that all people are fully human and capable of receiving the gospel. His position was supported by Pope Paul III, who affirmed that indigenous people should not be treated as inferior and are capable of receiving the Catholic faith, he issued his papal bull, Sublimes Dios, in support of the indigenous people and called for an end to the violence. These abuses were brought forward in the debate of Valladolid, where the treatment of indigenous people and the legitimacy of conquest were publicly being challenged. These responses represent a return to the core teaching that all humanity is created in the image of God. It calls the Church to separate its mission from political and military power and to transform itself to focus on salvation and human dignity. The Franciscan tradition offers a clear way to understand what authentic mission should look like. Francis of Assisi emphasizes humility, poverty, and service as the foundation of Christian life. His approach to evangelization is rooted not in power, but in relationship. This can be seen in the early Franciscan missionaries known as the 12 Apostles of Mexico, who lived among the indigenous people, learned their language, and focused on building Christian communities through humility, poverty, and service. In the Canticle of the Creatures, Francis presents a vision of creation in which all things are connected and reflect God's presence in everything. This includes every human person, since we all possess human dignity as part of God's creation. This perspective challenges the use of domination or force in missionary work. Instead, it calls for an approach that respects culture, upholds human dignity, and seeks genuine relationships. True evangelization is not about control or expansion, but about living the gospel in a way that invites others into a relationship with God. Francis taught us that not only in words, but also by his example as he lived. This reinforces the pattern we have seen throughout history. When the church becomes too closely aligned with power and too attracted to wealth, it is called back to the gospel by those who speak the truth and cry out for the church to reform, grounded in humility, dignity, and service. So we have journeyed across 3 moments in history. A clear pattern begins to emerge. The church starts with the gospel, grows in influence and power, begins to drift from its mission, and is then called back through reform. In the Constantine era, the church moved from persecution to power, which created a new tension between the simplicity of the gospel. At the Council of Trent, the church responded to internal corruption by clarifying doctrine and reforming its structure. During the missionary expansion, the church encountered new cultures, but its mission became entangled with the political and economic power, leading to serious moral and theological challenges. In each case, reform was necessary to restore the church to its true purpose. As we all know, history has a way of repeating itself, and this pattern of reform continues today. The church is always called to re-examine itself and to remain faithful to the gospel. It is an ongoing process that the church must actively pursue to adapt to the ever-changing environment. While institutional power can support the mission of the church, it can also obscure it when it becomes the focus. The history we have seen shows that true reform requires both clarity and humility. It requires a return to the core message of the gospel and a commitment to living authentically every day. The Franciscan tradition offers a clear model for this kind of renewal. Through humility, poverty, and service, it reminds us that the mission of the church is not to dominate, but to serve. Ultimately, the church must continually return to the gospel, allowing it to guide its actions, its structures, and its mission in the world. Well, that's it, Dad and family. Thank you for taking the time to watch and listen to my message about church reform today. May God give you peace.